Welcome to this compilation of 4 short stories by Lester Del Rey. I'll be narrating Operation Distress, Dead Ringer, and It Comes Out Here, and The Course of Logic. If you enjoy my narrations of classic sci-fi on YouTube, you might also like the modern novels I've narrated as audiobooks. The most recent of these is Lords of Conquest, Iron Raven by Nick Mayhew. Imagine the Roman Empire in space with elite warriors trained in a brutal academy. I'm really proud to have narrated the story. If you'd like to listen, you can do so on Audible or getting the standalone audiobook on Amazon. There are links in the description, plus links to Control Spark and Portals, 2 other books I've narrated. And if you haven't already, make sure to check out my Substack where I publish the bulk of my narrations in video, audio and podcast form, all ad-free. But for now, let's get to the 4 stories by Lester Del Rey. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Operation Distress by Lester Del Rey. Narrated by William Skye. Explorers who dread spiders and snakes prove that heroism is always more heroic to outsiders. Then there's the case of the first space pilot to Mars who developed the itch. Bill Adams was halfway back from Mars when he noticed the red rash on his hands. He'd been reaching for one of the few remaining tissues to cover a sneeze while scratching vigorously at the base of his neck. Then he saw the red spot and his hand halted, while all desire to sneeze gasped out of him. He sat there, 5 feet 7 inches of lean muscle and bronzed skin, sweating and staring while the blonde hair on the back of his neck seemed to stand on end. Finally, he dropped his hand and pulled himself carefully erect. The cabin in the spaceship was big enough to permit turning around, but not much more, and with the ship cruising without power, there was almost no gravity to keep him from overshooting his goal. He found the polished plate that served as a mirror and studied himself. His eyes were puffy, his nose was red, and there were other red splotches and marks on his face. Whatever it was, he had it bad. Pictures went through his head, all unpleasant. He'd been only a kid when the men came back from the South Pacific in the last war, but an uncle had spent years dying of some weird disease that the doctors couldn't identify. That had been something caught on Earth. What would happen when the disease was from another planet? It was ridiculous. Mars had no animal life, and even the thin lichen-like plants were sparse and tiny. A man couldn't catch a disease from a plant. Even horses didn't communicate their ills to men. Then Bill remembered gangrene and cancer, which could attack any life, apparently. He went back to the tiny Geiger-Müller counter, but there was no sign of radiation from the big atomic motor that powered the ship. He stripped his clothes off, spotting more of the red marks breaking out, but finding no sign of parasites. He hadn't really believed it anyhow. That wouldn't account for the sneezing and sniffles, or the puffed eyes and burning inside his nose and throat. Dust, maybe? Mars had been dusty, a waste of reddish sand and desert silt that made the Sahara seem like paradise, and it had settled on his spacesuit to come in through the airlocks with him. But if it contained some irritant, it should have been worse on Mars than now. He could remember nothing annoying, and he turned on the tiny compact little static dust traps, in any case, before leaving, to clear the air. He went back to one of the traps now and ripped the cover off it. The little motor purred briskly. The plastic rods turned against fur brushes while a wiper cleared off any dust they picked up. There was no dust he could see. The traps had done their work. Some plant irritant, like poison ivy? No, he'd always worn his suit. Mars had an atmosphere, but it wasn't anything a man could breathe long. The suit was put on and off with automatic machine grapples, so he couldn't have touched it. The rash seemed to get worse on his body as he looked at it. This time he tore one of the tissues in quarters as he sneezed. The little supply was almost gone. There was never space enough for much beyond essentials in a spaceship, even with the new atomic drive. As he looked for spots, the burning in his nose seemed to increase. He dropped back to the pilot seat, cursing. 2 months of being cramped up in this cubicle, sweating out the trip to Mars without knowing how the new engine would last. 3 weeks on Mars, mapping frantically to cover all the territory he could, and planting little flags 100 miles apart. Now a week on the trip back at high acceleration most of the way, and this. He'd expected adventure of some kind. Mars, though, had proved as interesting as a sandpile, and even the canals had proved to be only mineral striations, invisible from the ground. He looked for something to do, but found nothing. He'd developed his films the day before, after carefully cleaning the static traps and making sure the air was dust-free. He'd written up the accounts, and he'd been coasting along on the hope of getting home to a bath, a beer, and a few bull sessions, before he began to capitalize on being the first man to reach another planet beyond the moon. He cut on full acceleration again, more certain of his motors than of himself. He'd begun to notice the itching yesterday. Today he was breaking out in the rash. How long would whatever was coming take? Good God, he might die from something as humiliating and undramatic as this. It hadn't hit him before, fully. There was no knowing about diseases from other planets. Men had developed immunity to the germs found on Earth, but just as smallpox had proved so fatal to the Indians and syphilis to Europe when they first hit, there was no telling how wildly this might progress. It might go away in a day, or it might kill him just as quickly. He was figuring his new orbit on a tiny calculator. In 2 days at this acceleration, he could reach radar distance of Earth. In 4, he could land. The tubes might burn out in continuous firing, but the other way, he'd be 2 weeks making a landing, and most diseases he could remember seemed faster than that. Bill wiped the sweat off his forehead, scratched at other places that were itching, and stared down at the small disk of Earth. There were doctors there, and brother, he'd need them fast. Things were a little worse when the first squeals came from the radar 2 days later. He'd run out of tissues, and his nose was a continual drip, while breathing seemed almost impossible. He was running some fever too, though he had no way of knowing how much. He cut his receiver in, punched out the code on his key. The receiver pipped again at him, bits of message getting through, but unclearly. There was no response to his signals. He checked his chronometer and flipped over the micropages of his ephemeris. The big radar at Washington was still out of line with him, and the signals had to cut through too much air to come clearly. It should be good in another hour. But right now, an hour seemed longer than a normal year. He checked the dust tray again, tried figuring out other orbits, managed to locate the moon and scratched. 15 minutes. There was no room for pacing up and down. He pushed the back down from the pilot seat, lowered the table, and pulled out his bunk. He remade it, making sure all the corners were perfect. Then he folded it back and lifted the table and seat. That took less than 5 minutes. His hands were shaking worse when the automatic radar signals began to come through more clearly. It wasn't an hour, but he could wait no longer. He opened the key and began to send. It would take 15 seconds for the signal to reach Earth, and another quarter minute for an answer, even if an operator was on duty. Half a minute later, he found one was. Earth to Mars Rocket 1. Thank God, you're ahead of schedule. If your tubes hold out, crowd them. 2 other nations have ships out now. The UN has ruled that whoever comes back first with mapping surveys can claim the territory mapped. We're rushing the construction, but we need the ship for the second run if we're to claim our fair territory. Oh, hell, congratulations! He'd started hammering at his key before they finished, giving the facts on the tubes which were standing up beyond all expectations. And get a doctor ready, a bunch of them, he finished. I seem to have picked up something like a disease. There was a long delay before an answer came this time, more than 5 minutes. The hand on the key was obviously different, slower, and not as steady. What symptoms, Adams? Give all details. He began, giving all the information he had, from the first itching through the rash and the fever. Again, longer this time, the main station hesitated. Anything I can do about it now? Bill asked, finally. And how about having those doctors ready? We're checking with medical, the signals answered. Here's their report. Not enough data, could be anything. Dozens of diseases like that. Nothing you can do except try saltwater gargle and spray. You've got stuff for that. Wash off rash with soap and hot water, followed by some of your hypo. We'll get a medical kit up to the moon for you. He let that sink in, then clicked back. The moon? You think you can land here with whatever you've got, man? There's no way of knowing how contagious it is. And keep an hourly check with us. If you pass out, we'll try to get someone out in a moon rocket to pick you up. But we can't risk danger of infecting the whole planet. You're quarantined on the moon. We'll be sending up landing instructions later. Not even for lunar base, but where there'll be no chance of contamination for others. You didn't really expect to come back here, did you, Adams? He should have thought of it. He knew that, and he knew that the words from Earth weren't as callous as they sounded. Down there, men would be sweating with him, going crazy trying to do something. But they were right. Earth had to be protected first. Bill Adams was only 1 out of 2.5 billions, even if he had reached a planet before any other man. Yeah, it was fine to be a hero, but heroes shouldn't menace the rest of the world. Logically, he knew they were right. That helped him get his emotions under control. Where do you want me to put down? Tico. It isn't hard to spot for radar-controlled delivery of supplies to you, but it's a good 700 miles from lunar base. And look, we'll try to get a doctor to you, but keep us informed if anything slips. We need those maps, if we can find a way to sterilize them. Okay, he acknowledged. And tell the cartographers there are no craters, no intelligence, and only plants about 1/2 an inch high. Mars stinks. They'd already been busy, he saw, as he teetered down on his jets for a landing on Tico. Holding control was the hardest job he'd ever done. A series of itchings cropped out just as the work got tricky, when he could no longer see the surface and had to go by feel. But somehow he made it. Then he relaxed and began an orgy of scratching. And he'd thought there was something romantic about being a hero. The supplies that had already been sent up by the super-fast unmanned missiles would give him something to do at least. He moved back the 2 feet needed to reach his developing tanks and went through the process of spraying and gargling. It was soothing enough while it went on, but it offered only momentary help. Then his stomach began showing distress signs. He fought against it, tightening up. It did no good. His hasty breakfast of just black coffee wanted to come up, and did, giving him barely time to make the little booth. He washed his mouth out and grabbed for the radar key, banging out a report on this. The doctors must have been standing by down at the big station because there was only a slight delay before the answering signal came. Any blood? Another knot added itself to his intestines. I don't know. Don't think so, but I didn't look. Look next time. We're trying to get this related to some of the familiar diseases. It must have some relation. There are only so many ways a man can be sick. We've got a doctor coming over, Adams. None on the moon, but we're shipping him through. He'll set down in about 9 hours. And there's some stuff to take on the supply missiles. May not help, but we're trying a mixture of the antibiotics. Also some ACS and anodynes for the itching and rash. Hope they work. Let us know any reaction. Bill cut off. He'd have to try. They were as much in the dark about this as he was, but they had a better background for guessing and trial and error. And if the bugs in him happened to like tachyomycetin, he wouldn't be too much worse off. Damn it, had there been blood? He forced his mind off it, climbed into his clothes, and then into the spacesuit that hung from the grapples. It moved automatically into position, the 2 halves sliding shut and sealing from outside. The big gloves on his hands were too clumsy for such operations. Then he went bounding across the moon. Halfway to the supplies, he felt the itching coming back, and he slithered and wriggled around, trying to scratch his skin against his clothing. It didn't help much. He was sweating harder and his eyes were watering. He manipulated the little visor-cleaning gadget, trying to poke his face forward to brush the frustration tears from his eyes. He couldn't quite reach it. There were 3 supply missiles, each holding about 200 pounds, Earth weight. He tied them together and slung them over his back, heading toward his ship. Here they weighed only 100 pounds, and with his own weight and the suit added, the whole load came to little more than his normal weight on Earth. He tried shifting the supplies around on his back, getting them to press against the spots of torment as he walked. It simply unbalanced him, without really relieving the itching. Fortunately, though, his eyes were clearing a little. He gritted his teeth and fought back through the powdery pumice surface, kicking up clouds of dust that settled slowly but completely. Though the gravity was low, there was no air to hold them up. Nothing had ever looked better than the airlock of the ship. He let the grapples hook the suit off him as soon as the outer seal was shut, and went into a whirling dervish act. Aches and pain could be stood, But itching... Apparently, though, the spray and gargle had helped a little, since his nose felt somewhat clearer and his eyes were definitely better. He repeated them, and then found the medical supplies with a long list of instructions. They were really shooting the pharmacy at him. He injected himself, swallowed things, rubbed himself down with others, and waited. Whatever they'd given him didn't offer any immediate help. He began to feel worse. But on contacting Earth by radar, he was assured that that might be expected. "We've got another missile coming, with metal foil for the maps and photos, plus a small copying camera. You can print them right on the metal, seal that in a can, and leave it for the rocket that's bringing the doctor. The pilot will blast over it, that should sterilize it, and pick it up when it cools." Bill swore, but he was in his suit when the missile landed, heading out across the pumice-covered wastes towards it. The salves had helped the itching a little, but not much, and his nose had grown worse again. He jockeyed the big supply can out of the torpedo-shaped missile, packed it on his back, and headed for his ship. The itching was acting up as he sweated. This made a real load, about like packing 100 bulky pounds over his normal Earth weight through the soft drift of the pumice. But his nose was clearing again. It was apparently becoming cyclic. He'd have to relay that information back to the medics. And where were they getting a doctor crazy enough to take a chance with him? He climbed out of the suit and went through the ritual of scratching, noticing that his fever had gone up and that his muscles were shaking. His head seemed light, as if he were in for a spell of dizziness. They'd be interested in that, back on Earth, though it wouldn't do much good. He couldn't work up a clinical attitude about himself. All he wanted was a chance to get over this disease before it killed him. He dragged out the photo and copying equipment under a red light. It filled what little space was left in his cubbyhole cabin. Then he swore, gulping down more of the pills where they were waiting for him. The metal sheets were fine, they were excellent. The only thing wrong was that they wouldn't fit his developing trays, and they were tough enough to give him no way of cutting them to size. He stuffed them back in their container and shoved it into the airlock. Then his stomach kicked up again. He couldn't see any blood in the result, but he couldn't be sure. The colour of the pills might hide traces. He flushed it down, his head turning in circles, and went to the radar. This time he didn't even wait for a reply. Let them worry about their damned maps. They could send cutting equipment with the doctor and pick up the things later. They could pick up his corpse and cremate it at the same time for all he cared right now. He yanked out his bunk and slumped into it, curling up as much as the itching would permit. And finally, for the first time in over 50 hours, he managed to doze off, though his sleep was full of nightmares. It was the sound of the bull-throated chemical rocket that brought him out of it, the sound travelling along the surface through the rocks and up through the metal ship, even without air to carry it. He could feel the rumble of its takeoff later, but he waited long after that for the doctor. There was no knock on the port. Finally he pulled himself up from the bunk, sweating and shaken, and looked out. The doctor was there, or at least a man in a spacesuit was. But somebody had been in a hurry for volunteers and given the man no basic training at all. The figure would pull itself erect, make a few strides that were all bounce and no progress, and then slide down into the pumice. Moonwalking was tricky until you learned how. Bill sighed, scratching unconsciously, and made his way somehow out to his suit, climbing into it. He paused for a final good scratch, and then the grapples took over. This time he stumbled also as he made his way across the powdery rubble. But the other man was making no real progress at all. Bill reached him and touched helmets long enough to issue simple instructions through metal sound conduction. Then he managed to guide the other's steps. There had been accounts of the days of learning spent by the first men on the moon, but it wasn't that bad with an instructor to help. The doctor picked up as they went along. Bill's legs were buckling under him by then, and the itches were past endurance. At the end, the doctor was helping him. But somehow they made the ship, and were getting out of the suits, Bill first, then the doctor, using the grapples under Bill's guidance. The doctor was young, and obviously scared, but fighting his fear. He'd been picked for his smallness to lighten the load on the chemical rocket, and his little face was intent. But he managed a weak grin. "Thanks, Adams. I'm Dr. Ames. Ted to you. Get onto that cot. You're about out on your feet." The test he made didn't take long, but his head was shaking at the conclusion. "Your symptoms make no sense," he summarized. "I've got a feeling some are due to one thing, some to another. Maybe we'll have to wait until I come down with it and compare notes. His grin was wry, but Bill was vaguely glad that he wasn't trying any bedside manner. There wasn't much use in thanking the man for volunteering. Ames had known what he was up against, and he might be scared, but his courage was above thanks. "What about the maps?" Bill asked. "They tell you?" "They've left cutters outside. I started to bring them. Then the pumice got me. I couldn't stand upright in it. They'll pick up the maps later, but they're important. The competing ships will claim our territory if we don't file first." He knocked the dust off his instrument and wiped his hands. Bill looked down at the bed to see a fine film of moon silt there. They'd been bringing in too much on the suits. It was too fine and the traps weren't getting it fast enough. He got up shakily, moving toward the dust trap that had been running steadily. But now it was out of order, obviously, with the fur brushes worn down until they could generate almost no static against the rod. He groped into the supplies, hoping there would be replacements. Ames caught his arm. "Cut it out, Adams. You're in no shape for this. Hey, how long since you've eaten?" Bill thought it over, his head thick. "I had coffee before I landed." Dr. Ames nodded quickly. "Vomiting, dizziness, tremors, excess sweating? What did you expect, man? You put yourself under this strain, not knowing what comes next, having to land with an empty stomach, skipping meals and loading your stomach with pills, and probably no sleep. Those symptoms are perfectly normal." He was at the tiny galley equipment, fixing quick food as he spoke, but his face was still sober. He was probably thinking of the same thing that worried Bill. An empty stomach didn't make the itching rash, the runny nose and eyes, and the general misery that had begun the whole thing. He sorted through the stock of replacement parts, a few field sisters, suit wadding, spare gloves, cellophane-wrapped gadgets. Then he had it. Ames was over, urging him toward the cot, but he shook him off. "Got to get the dust out of here. Dust'll make the itching worse. Moon dust is sharp, Doc. Just install new brushes. Where are those instructions? Yeah, insert the cat's fur brushes under the—" "Cat's fur? Is that what they use, Doc?" "Sure, it's cheap and generates static electricity. Do you expect sable?" Bill took the can of soup and sipped it without tasting or thinking, his hand going toward a fresh place that itched. His nose began running, but he disregarded it. He still felt lousy, but strength was flowing through him, and life was almost good again. He tossed the bunk back into its slot, lifted the pilot's stool, and motioned Ames forward. "You operate a key. Hell, I am getting slow. You can contact Lunar Base by phone, have them relay. There. Now tell them I'm blasting off pronto for Earth, and I'll be down in 4 hours with their plans." "You're crazy." The words were flat, but there was desperation on the little doctor's face. He glanced about hastily, taking the microphone woodenly. "Adams, they'll have an atomic bomb up to blast you out before you're near Earth. They've got to protect themselves. You can't." Bill scratched, but there was the beginning of a grin on his face. "Nope, I'm not delirious now, though I damn near cracked up. You figured out half the symptoms. Take a look at those brushes, cat's fur brushes, and figure what they'll do to a man who was breathing the air and who was allergic to cats. All I ever had was a jerk in planning who didn't check my medical record with trip logistics. I never had these symptoms until I unzipped the traps and turned them on. It got better whenever I was in the suit breathing canned air. We should have known a man can't catch a disease from plants." The doctor looked at him, and at the fur pieces he'd thrown into a waste bin, and the whiteness ran from his face. He was seeing his own salvation, and the chuckle began weakly, gathering strength as he turned to the microphone. "Cat asthma. Simple allergy. Who'd figure you'd get that in deep space? But you're right, Bill, it figures." Bill Adams nodded as he reached for the controls and the tubes began firing, ready to take them back to Earth. Then he caught himself and swung to the doctor. "Doc," he said quickly, "just be sure and tell them this isn't to get out. If they'll keep still about it, so will I. He'd make a hell of a hero on Earth if people heard of it, and he could use a little of a hero's reward. No cat calls, thanks." Dead Ringer by Lester Del Rey. Narrated by William Skye. A brief content warning before we start. This story contains scenes of violence and suicide. If that might upset you, why not check out one of the many other stories on my channel. There was nothing, especially on Earth, which could set him free. The truth least of all. Dane Phillips slouched in the window seat, watching the morning crowds on their way to work and carefully avoiding any attempt to read Jordan's old face as the editor skimmed through the notes. He had learned to make his tall, bony body seem all loose-jointed relaxation, no matter what he felt, but the oversized hands in his pockets were clenched so tightly that the nails were cutting into his palms. Every tick of the old-fashioned clock sent a throb racing through his brain. Every rustle of the pages seemed to release a fresh shot of adrenaline into his bloodstream. This time, his mind was pleading. It has to be right this time. Jordan finished his reading and shoved the folder back. He reached for his pipe, sighed, and then nodded slowly. "A nice job of researching, Phillips. And it might make a good feature for the Sunday section at that." It took a second to realize that the words meant acceptance, for Phillips had prepared himself too thoroughly against another failure. Now he felt the tautened muscles release so quickly that he would have fallen if he hadn't been braced against the seat. He groped in his mind, hunting for words and finding none. There was only the hot, sudden flame of unbelieving hope, and then an almost blinding exultation. Jordan didn't seem to notice his silence. The editor made a neat pile of the notes, nodding again. "Sure, I like it. We've been short of shock stuff lately, and the readers go for it when we can get a fresh angle. But naturally you'd have to leave out all that nonsense on Blanding. Hell, the man's just buried, and his relatives and friends." "But that's the proof." Phillips stared at the editor, trying to penetrate through the haze of hope that had somehow grown chilled and unreal. His thoughts were abruptly disorganized and out of his control. Only the urgency remained. "It's the key evidence. And we've got to move fast. I don't know how long it takes, but even one more day may be too late." Jordan nearly dropped the pipe from his lips as he jerked upright to peer sharply at the younger man. "Are you crazy? Do you seriously expect me to get an order to exhume him now? What would it get us other than lawsuits? Even if we could get the order without cause, which we can't." Then the pipe did fall as he gaped open-mouthed. "My God, you believe all that stuff? You expected us to publish it straight?" "No," Dane said thickly. The hope was gone now, as if it had never existed, leaving a numb emptiness where nothing mattered. "No, I guess I didn't really expect anything. But I believe the facts. Why shouldn't I?" He reached for the papers with hands he could hardly control and began stuffing them back into the folder. All the careful documentation, the fingerprints, smudged perhaps in some cases, but still evidence enough for anyone but a fool. "Phillips," Jordan said questioningly to himself, and then his voice was taking on a new edge. "Phillips. Wait a minute, I've got it now. Dane Phillips, not Arthur. 2 years on the Trib. Then you turned up on the Register in Seattle. Philip Dean or some such name there." "Yeah," Dane agreed. There was no use in denying anything now. "Yeah, Dane Arthur Phillips. So I suppose I'm through here." Jordan nodded again, and there was a faint look of fear in his expression. "You can pick up your pay on the way out. And make it quick before I change my mind and call the boys in white." It could have been worse. It had been worse before. And there was enough in the pay envelope to buy what he needed: a flash camera, a little folding shovel from one of the surplus houses, and a bottle of good scotch. It would be dark enough for him to taxi out to Oakhaven Cemetery, where Blanding had been buried. It wouldn't change the minds of fools, of course. Even if he could drag back what he might find without the change being completed, they wouldn't accept the evidence. He'd been crazy to think anything could change their minds. And they called him a fanatic. If the facts he'd dug up in 10 years of hunting wouldn't convince them, nothing would. And yet he had to see for himself before it was too late. He picked a cheap hotel at random and checked in under an assumed name. He couldn't go back to his room while there was a chance that Jordan still might try to turn him in. There wouldn't be time for Sylvia's detectives to bother him, probably, but there was the ever-present danger that one of the aliens might intercept the message. He shivered. He'd been risking that for 10 years, yet the likelihood was still a horror to him. The uncertainty made it harder to take than any human-devised torture could be. There was no way of guessing what an alien might do to anyone who discovered that all men were not human, that some were zombies. There was the classic syllogism. All men are mortal. I am a man, therefore I am mortal. But not Blanding, or Corporal Harding. It was Harding's death that had started it all during the fighting on Guadalcanal. A grenade had come flying into the foxhole where Dane and Harding had felt reasonably safe. The concussion had knocked Dane out, possibly saving his life when the enemy thought he was dead. He'd come to in the daylight to see Harding lying there, mangled and twisted, with his throat torn. There was blood on Dane's uniform, obviously spattered from the dead man. It hadn't been a mistake or delusion. Harding had been dead. It had taken Dane 2 days of crawling and hiding to get back to his group, too exhausted to report Harding's death. He'd slept for 20 hours, and when he awoke, Harding had been standing beside him with a whole throat and a fresh uniform, grinning and kidding him for running off and leaving a stunned friend behind. It was no ringer, but Harding himself, complete to the smallest personal memories and personality traits. The pressures of war probably saved Dane's sanity while he learned to face the facts. All men are mortal. Harding is not mortal, therefore Harding is not a man. Nor was Harding alone. Dane found enough evidence to know there were others. The Tribune morgue yielded even more data. A man had faced 7 firing squads and walked away. Another survived over a dozen attacks by professional killers. Fingerprints turned up mysteriously copied from those of men long dead. Some of the aliens seemed to heal almost instantly, others took days. Some operated completely alone, some seemed to have joined with others. But they were legion. Lack of a clearer pattern of attack made him consider the possibility of human mutation, but such tissue was too wildly different, and the invasion had begun long before atomics or X-rays. He gave up trying to understand their alien motivations. It was enough that they existed in secret, slowly growing in numbers while mankind was unaware of them. When his proof was complete and irrefutable, he took it to his editor, to be fired politely but coldly. Other editors were less polite. But he went on doggedly trying and failing. What else could he do? Somehow he had to find the few people who could recognize facts and warn them. The aliens would get him, of course, when the story broke, but a warned humanity could cope with them. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Then he met Sylvia by accident after losing his 5th job, a girl who had inherited a fortune big enough to spread his message in paid ads across the country. They were married before he found she was hard-headed about her money. She demanded a full explanation for every cent beyond his allowance. In the end, she got the explanation, and while he was trying to cash the check she gave him, she visited Dr. Buell to come back with a squad of quiet, refined, strong-arm boys who made sure Dane reached Buell's rest home safely. Hydrotherapy, Buell as the kindly, firm father image, analysis, hypnosis that stripped every secret from him, including his worst childhood nightmare. His father had committed a violent, bloody suicide after one of the many quarrels with Dane's mother. Dane had found the body. 2 nights after the funeral, he had dreamed of his father's face, horror-filled, at the window. He knew now that it was a normal nightmare caused by being forced to look at the face in the coffin, but the shock had lasted for years. It had bothered him again after his discovery of the aliens, until a thorough check had proved without doubt that his father had been fully human, with a human, if tempestuous, childhood behind him. Dr. Buell was delighted. "You see, Dane, you know it was a nightmare, but you don't really believe it even now. Your father was an alien monster to you. No adult is quite human to a child. And that literal-minded self, your subconscious, saw him after he died. So there are alien monsters who return from death.
Then you come to from a concussion. Harding is sprawled out unconscious, covered with blood, probably your blood, since you say he wasn't wounded later. But after seeing your father, you can't associate blood with yourself. You see it as a horrible wound on Harding. When he turns out to be alive, you're still in partial shock with your subconscious dominant. And that has the answer already. There are monsters who come back from the dead. An exaggerated reaction, but nothing really abnormal. We'll have you out of here in no time. No non-directive psychiatry for Buell. The man beamed paternally, chuckling as he added what he must have considered the clincher. Anyhow, even zombies can't stand fire, Dane, so you can stop worrying about Harding. I checked up on him. He was burned to a crisp in a hotel fire 2 months ago. It was logical enough to shake Dane's faith until he came across Milo Blanding's picture in a magazine article on society in St. Louis. According to the item, Milo was a cousin of the Blandings, whose father had vanished in Chile as a young man and who had just rejoined the family. The picture was of Harding. An alien could have gotten away by simply committing suicide and being carried from the rest home, but Dane had to do it the hard way, watching his chance and using commando tactics on a guard who had come to accept him as a harmless nut. In St. Louis, he'd used the purloined letter technique to hide, going back to newspaper work and using almost his real name. It had seemed to work too, but he'd been less lucky about Harding Blanding. The man had been in Europe on some kind of a tour until his return only this last week. Dane had seen him just once then, but long enough to be sure it was Harding, before he died again. This time it was in a drunken auto accident that seemed to be none of his fault but left his body in a mangled wreck. It was almost dark when Dane dismissed the taxi at the false address, a mile from the entrance to the cemetery. He watched it turn back down the road, then picked up the valise with his camera and folding shovel. He shivered as he moved reluctantly ahead. War had proved that he would never be a brave man, and the old fears of darkness and graveyards were still strong in him. But he had to know what the coffin contained now, if it wasn't already too late. It represented the missing link in his picture of the aliens. What happened to them during the period of regrowth? Did they revert to their natural form? Were they at all conscious while the body reshaped itself into wholeness? Dane had puzzled over it night after night with no answer. Nor could he figure how they could escape from the grave. Perhaps a man could force his way out of some of the coffins he had inspected. The soil would still be soft and loose in the grave, and a lot of the coffins and the boxes around them were strong in appearance only. A determined creature that could exist without much air for long enough might make it. But there were other caskets that couldn't be cracked, at least without the aid of outside help. What happened when a creature that could survive even the poison of embalming fluids and the draining of all the blood woke up in such a coffin? Dane's mind skittered from it, as always, and then came back to it reluctantly. There were still accounts of corpses turned up with the nails and hair grown long in the grave. Could normal tissue stand the current tricks of the morticians to have life enough for such growth? The possibility was absurd. Those cases had to be aliens, ones who hadn't escaped. Even they must die eventually in such a case, after weeks and months. It took time for hair to grow. And there were stories of corpses that had apparently fought and twisted in their coffins still. What was it like for an alien then, going slowly mad while it waited for true death? How long did madness take? He shivered again, but went steadily on while the cemetery fence appeared in the distance. He'd seen Blanding's coffin, and the big solid metal casket around it that couldn't be cracked by any amount of effort and strength. He was sure the creature was still there, unless it had a confederate. But that wouldn't matter. An empty coffin would also be proof. Dane avoided the main gate, unsure about whether there would be a watchman or not. 100 feet away there was a tree near the ornamental spikes of the iron fence. He threw his bag over and began shinnying up. It was difficult, but he made it finally, dropping onto the soft grass beyond. There was the trace of the moon at times through the clouds, but it hadn't betrayed him, and there had been no alarm wire along the top of the fence. He moved from shadow to shadow, his hair prickling along the base of his neck. Locating the right grave in the darkness was harder than he had expected, even with an occasional brief use of the small flashlight. But at last he found the marker that was serving until the regular monument could arrive. His hands were sweating so much that it was hard to use the small shovel, but the digging of foxholes had given him experience and the ground was still soft from the gravedigger's work. He stopped once as the moon came out briefly. Again, a sound in the darkness above left him hovering and sick in the hole. But it must have been only some animal. He uncovered the top of the casket with hands already blistering. Then he cursed as he realized the catches were near the bottom, making his work even harder. He reached them at last, fumbling them open. The metal top of the casket seemed to be a dome of solid lead, and he had no room to maneuver, but it began swinging up reluctantly until he could feel the polished wood of the coffin. Dane reached for the lid with hands he could barely control. Fear was thick in his throat now. What could an alien do to a man who discovered it? Would it be Harding there, or some monstrous thing still changing? How long did it take a revived monster to go mad when it found no way to escape? He gripped the shovel in one hand, working at the lid with the other. Now, abruptly, his nerves steadied, as they had done whenever he was in real battle. He swung the lid up and began groping for the camera. His hand went into the silk-lined interior and found nothing. He was too late. Either Harding had gotten out somehow before the final ceremony, or a Confederate had already been here. The coffin was empty. There were no warning sounds this time, only hands that slipped under his arms and across his mouth, lifting him easily from the grave. A match flared briefly, and he was looking into the face of Buell's chief strong-arm man. "Hello, Mr. Phillips. Promise to be quiet and we'll release you, okay?" At Dane's sickened nod, he gestured to the others. "Let him go, and Tom, better get that filled in. We don't want any trouble from this." Surprise came from the grave a moment later. "Hey, Burke, there's no corpse here." Burke's words killed any hopes Dane had at once. "So what? Ever hear of cremation? Lots of people use a regular coffin for the ashes." "He wasn't cremated," Dane told him. "You can check up on that." But he knew it was useless. "Sure, Mr. Phillips, we'll do that." The tone was one reserved for humouring madmen. Burke turned, gesturing. "Better come along, Mr. Phillips. Your wife and Dr. Buell are waiting at the hotel." The gate was open now, but there was no sign of a watchman. If one worked here, Sylvia's money would have taken care of that, of course. Dane went along quietly, sitting in the rubble of his hopes while the big car purred through the morning and on down Lindell Boulevard toward the hotel. Once he shivered and Burke dug out hot brandied coffee. They had thought of everything, including a coat to cover his dirt-soiled clothes as they took him up the elevator to where Buell and Sylvia were waiting for him. She had been crying, obviously, but there were no tears or recriminations when she came over to kiss him. Funny, she must still love him. As he'd learned to his surprise, he loved her. Under different circumstances. "So you found me?" he asked needlessly of Buell. He was operating on purely automatic habits now, the reaction from the night and his failure numbing him emotionally. "Jordan got in touch with you?" Buell smiled back at him. "We knew where you were all along, Dane. But as long as you acted normal, we hoped it might be better than the home. Too bad we couldn't stop you before you got all mixed up in this." "So I suppose I'm committed to your booby hatch again?" Buell nodded, refusing to resent the term. "I'm afraid so, Dane, for a while anyhow. You'll find your clothes in that room. Why don't you clean up a little? Take a hot bath, maybe. You'll feel better." Dane went in, surprised when no guards followed him. But they had thought of everything. What looked like a screen on the window had been recently installed, and it was strong enough to prevent his escape. "Blessed are the poor, for they shall be poorly guarded." He was turning on the shower when he heard the sound of voices coming through the door. He left the water running and came back to listen. Sylvia was speaking. "Seems so logical, so completely rational." "It makes him a dangerous person," Buell answered, and there was no false warmth in his voice now. "Sylvia, you've got to admit it to yourself. All the reason and analysis in the world won't convince him he's wrong. This time we'll have to use shock treatment. Burn over those memories, fade them out. It's the only possible course." There was a pause and then a sigh. "I suppose you're right." Dane didn't wait to hear more. He drew back while his mind fought to accept the hideous reality. Shock treatment? The works, if what he knew of psychiatry was correct. Enough of it to erase his memories, a part of himself. It wasn't therapy Buell was considering. It couldn't be. It was the answer of an alien that had a human in its hands, one who knew too much. He might have guessed. What better place for an alien than in the guise of a psychiatrist? Where else was there the chance for all the refined, modern torture needed to burn out a man's mind? Dane had spent 10 years in fear of being discovered by them, and now Buell had him. Sylvia? He couldn't be sure. Probably she was human. It wouldn't make any difference. There was nothing he could do through her. Either she was part of the game, or she really thought him mad. Dane tried the window again, but it was hopeless. There would be no escape this time. Buell couldn't risk it. The shock treatment, or whatever Buell would use under the name of shock treatment, would begin at once. It would be easy to slip, to use an overdose of something, to make sure Dane was killed. Or there were ways of making sure it didn't matter. They could leave him alive, but take his mind away. In alien hands, human psychiatry could do worse than all the medieval torture chambers. The sickness grew in his stomach as he considered the worst that could happen. Death he could accept if he had to. He could even face the chance of torture by itself, as he had accepted the danger while trying to have his facts published. But to have his mind taken from him, a step at a time, to watch his personality, his ego, rotted away under him, and to know that he would wind up as a drooling idiot. He made his decision almost as quickly as he had come to realize what Buell must be. There was a razor in the medicine chest. It was a safety razor, of course, but the blade was sharp and it would be big enough. There was no time for careful planning. One of the guards might come in at any moment if they thought he was taking too long. Some fear came back as he leaned over the wash basin, staring at his throat, fingering the suddenly murderous blade. But the pain wouldn't last long, a lot less than there would be under shock treatment, and less pain. He'd read enough to feel sure of that. Twice he braced himself and failed at the last second. His mind flashed out in wild schemes, fighting against what it knew had to be done. The world still had to be warned. If he could escape somehow, if he could still find a way, he couldn't quit, no matter how impossible things looked. But he knew better. There was nothing one man could do against the aliens in this world they had taken over. He'd never had a chance. Man had been chained already by carefully developed ridicule against superstition, by carefully indoctrinated gobbledygook about insanity, persecution complexes, and all the rest. For a second, Dane even considered the possibility that he was insane. But he knew it was only a blind effort to cling to life. There had been no insanity in him when he'd groped for evidence in the coffin and found it empty. He leaned over the wash basin, his eyes focused on his throat, and his hand came down and around, carrying the razor blade through a lethal semicircle. Dane Phillips watched fear give place to sickness on his face as the pain lanced through him and the blood spurted. He watched horror creep up to replace the sickness while the bleeding stopped and the gash began closing. By the time he recognized his expression as the same one he'd seen on his father's face at the window so long ago, the wound was completely healed. If you're enjoying the stories, hit the like button to help the channel grow. Thanks.
And It Comes Out Here by Lester Del Rey. Narrated by William Skye. There is one fact no sane man can quarrel with. Everything has a beginning and an end. But some men aren't sane. Thus it isn't always so. No, you're wrong. I'm not your father's ghost, even if I do look a bit like him. But it's a longish story, and you might as well let me in. You will, you know, so why quibble about it? At least you always have, or do, or will. I don't know, verbs get all mixed up. We don't have the right attitude toward tenses for a situation like this. Anyhow, you'll let me in. I did, so you will. Thanks. You think you're crazy, of course, but you'll find out you aren't. It's just that things are a bit confused. And don't look at the machine out there too long. Until you get used to it, you'll find it's hard on the eyes, trying to follow where the veins go. You'll get used to it, of course, but it will take about 30 years. You're wondering whether to give me a drink as I remember it. Why not? And naturally, since we have the same tastes, you can make the same for me as you're having. Of course we have the same tastes. We're the same person. I'm you 30 years from now, or you're me. I remember just how you feel. I felt the same way when he, that is, of course, I, or we, came back to tell me about it 30 years ago. Here, have one of these. You'll get to like them in a couple more years. And you can look at the revenue stamp date if you still doubt my story. You'll believe it eventually, though, so it doesn't matter. Right now you're shocked. It's a real wrench when a man meets himself for the first time. Some kind of telepathy seems to work between two of the same people. You sense things. So I'll simply go ahead talking for half an hour or so until you get over it. After that you'll come along with me. You know, I could try to change things around by telling what happened to me, but I, told me what I was going to do, so I might as well do the same. I probably couldn't help telling you the same thing in the same words even if I tried, and I don't intend to try. I've gotten past that stage in worrying about all this. So let's begin when you get up in half an hour and come out with me. You'll take a closer look at the machine then. Yes, it'll be pretty obvious it must be a time machine. You'll sense that too. You've seen it. Just a small little cage with 2 seats, a luggage compartment, and a few buttons on a dash. You'll be puzzling over what I'll tell you, and you'll be getting used to the idea that you are the man who makes atomic power practical. Jerome Boal. Just a plain engineer, the man who put atomic power in every home. You won't exactly believe it, but you'll want to go along. I'll be tired of talking by then, and in a hurry to get going, so I cut off your questions and get you inside. I snap on a green button and everything seems to cut off around us. You can see a sort of foggy nothing surrounding the cockpit. It is probably the field that prevents passage through time from affecting us. The luggage section isn't protected, though. You start to say something, but by then I'm pressing a black button and everything outside will disappear. You look for your house, but it isn't there. There is exactly nothing there. In fact, there is no there. You are completely outside of time and space, as best you can guess how things are. You can't feel any motion, of course. You try to reach a hand out through the field into the nothing around you, and your hand goes out all right, but nothing happens. Where the screen ends, your hand just turns over and pokes back at you. Doesn't hurt, and when you pull your arm back, you're still sound and uninjured. But it looks frightening, and you don't try it again. Then it comes to you slowly that you're actually travelling in time. You turn to me, getting used to the idea. So this is the 4th dimension? You ask. Then you feel silly because you'll remember that I said you'd ask that. Well, I asked it after I was told, then I came back and told it to you, and I still can't help answering when you speak. Not exactly, I try to explain. Maybe it's no dimension, or it might be the 5th. If you're going to skip over the so-called 4th without travelling along it, you'd need a 5th. Don't ask me. I didn't invent the machine and I don't understand it. But I let it go and so do you. If you don't, it's a good way of going crazy. You'll see later why I couldn't have invented the machine. Of course, there may have been a start for all this once. There may have been a time when you did invent the machine, the atomic motor first, then the time machine, and when you closed the loop by going back and saving yourself the trouble, it got all tangled up. I figured out once that such a universe would need some 7 or 8 time and space dimensions. It's simpler just to figure that this is the way time got bent back on itself. Maybe there is no machine, and it's just easier for us to imagine it. When you spend 30 years thinking about it, as I did, and you will, you get further and further from an answer. Anyhow, you sit there, watching nothing all around you, and no time, apparently, though there is a time effect back in the luggage space. You look at your watch and it's still running. That means you either carry a small time field with you, or you are catching a small increment of time from the main field. I don't know, and you won't think about that then either. I'm smoking and so are you, and the air in the machine is getting a bit stale. You suddenly realize that everything in the machine is wide open, yet you haven't seen any effects of air loss. Where are we getting our air, you ask, or why don't we lose it? No place for it to go, I explain. There isn't. Out there is neither time nor space, apparently. How could the air leak out? You still feel gravity, but I can't explain that either. Maybe the machine has a gravity field built in, or maybe the time that makes your watch run is responsible for gravity. In spite of Einstein, you have always had the idea that time is an effect of gravity, and I sort of agree still. Then the machine stops, at least the field around us cuts off. You feel a dankish sort of air replace the stale air, and you breathe easier, though we're in complete darkness except for the weak light in the machine, which always burns, and a few feet of rough dirty cement floor around. You take another cigarette from me and you get out of the machine just as I do. I've got a bundle of clothes and I start changing. It's a sort of simple, short-limbed one-piece affair I put on, but it feels comfortable. I'm staying here, I tell you. This is like the things they wear in this century, as near as I can remember it, and I should be able to pass fairly well. I've had all my fortune, the one you make on that atomic generator, invested in such a way I can get it on using some identification I've got with me, so I'll do all right. I know they still use some kind of money, you'll see evidence of that. And it's a pretty easygoing civilization from what I could see. We'll go up and I'll leave you. I like the look of things here, so I won't be coming back with you. You nod, remembering I've told you about it. What century is this anyway? I told you that too, but you've forgotten. As near as I can guess, it's about 2150. He told me, just as I'm telling you, that it's an interstellar civilization. You take another cigarette from me and follow me. I've got a small flashlight and we grope through a pile of rubbish out into a corridor. This is a sub basement. We have to walk up a flight of stairs, and there is an elevator waiting, fortunately, with the door open. What about the time machine, you ask? Since nobody ever stole it, it's safe. We get in the elevator, and I say first to it. It gives out a coughing noise, and the basement openings begin to click by us. There's no feeling of acceleration, some kind of false gravity they use in the future. Then the door opens, and the elevator says first, back at us. It's obviously a service elevator, and we're in a dim corridor with nobody around. I grab your hand and shake it. You go that way. Don't worry about getting lost, you never did, so you can't. Find the museum, grab the motor, and get out. And good luck to you. You act as if you're dreaming, though you can't believe it's a dream. You nod at me, and I move out into the main corridor. A second later, you see me going by, mixed into a crowd that is loafing along toward a restaurant or something like it, that is just opening. I'm asking questions of a man who points, and I turn and move off. You come out of the side corridor and go down a hall, away from the restaurant. There are quiet little signs along the hall. You look at them, realizing for the first time that things have changed. Stationery Fountain, Zergat Dispensary. The signs are very quiet and dignified. Some of them can be decoded to stationery shops, fountains, and the like. What a Zergot is, you don't know. You stop at a sign that announces, Travel Bureau, First Class, Tours Mars, Venus, and Trojan planets. Special rates to owl suns within 60 light years. But there is only a single picture of a dull-looking metal sphere with passengers moving up a ramp, and the office is closed. You begin to get the hang of the spelling they use, though. Now there are people around you, but nobody pays much attention to you. Why should they? You wouldn't care if you saw a man in a leopard skin suit. You'd figure it was some part in a play and let it go. Well, people don't change much. You get up your courage and go up to a boy selling something that might be papers on tapes. Where can I find the Museum of Science? Down here, Ryan, turn left for the sign. Stu Bloss, he tells you. Around you, you hear some pretty normal English, but there are others using stuff as garbled as his. The educated and uneducated? I don't know. You go right until you find a big sign built into the rubbery surface of the walk. Museum of Science. There's an arrow pointing and you turn left. Ahead of you, 2 blocks on, you can see a pink building with faint aqua trimming, bigger than most of the others. They are building lower than they used to, apparently. 20 floors up seems about the maximum. You head for it and find the sidewalk is marked with the information that it is the museum. You go up the steps, but you see that it seems to be closed. You hesitate for a moment then. You're beginning to think the whole affair is complete nonsense and you should get back to the time machine and go home. But then a guard comes to the gate. Except for the short legs in his suit and the friendly grin on his face, he looks like any other guard. What's more, he speaks pretty clearly. Everyone says things in a sort of drawl with softer vowels and slurred consonants, but it's rather pleasant. "Help you, sir? Oh, of course. You must be playing in Atoms and Axioms. The museum's closed, but I'll be glad to let you study whatever you need for realism in your role. Nice show. I saw it twice." "Thanks," you mutter, wondering what kind of civilization can produce guards as polite as that. I'm told I should investigate your display of atomic generators." He beams at that. "Of course." The gate is swung to behind you, but obviously he isn't locking it. In fact, there doesn't seem to be a lock. "Must be a new part. You go down that corridor, up one flight of stairs and left. Finest display in all the known worlds. We've got the original of the first 13 models. Professor Jonas was using them to check his latest theory of how they work. Too bad he could not explain the principle either. Someone will, someday, though. Lord, the genius of that 20th century inventor. It's quite a hobby with me, sir. I've read everything I could get on the period. Oh, congratulations on your pronunciation. Sounds just like some of our oldest tapes." You get away from him, finally, after some polite thanks. The building seems deserted and you wander up the stairs. There's a room on your right filled with something that proclaims itself the first truly plastic diamond former, and you go up to it. As you come near, it goes through a crazy wiggle inside, stops turning out a continual row of what seem to be bearings, and slips something the size of a penny toward you. "Souvenir," it announces in a well-modulated voice. "This is a typical gem of the 20th century, properly cut to 58 facets, known technically as a Jaeger diamond, and approximately 20 carats in size. You can have it made into a ring on the 3rd floor during morning hours for 1/10 credit. If you have more than one child, press the red button for the number of stones you desire." You put it in your pocket, gulping a little, and get back to the corridor. You turn left and go past a big room in which models of spaceships, from the original thing that looks like a V2 and is labelled First Lunar Rocket, to a 10-foot globe complete with miniature mannequins, are sailing about in some kind of orbits. Then there is one labelled Weapons, filled with everything from a crossbow to a tiny rod 4 inches long and half the thickness of a pencil, marked Final Hand Arm. Beyond is the end of the corridor and a big place that bears a sign, Models of Atomic Power Sources. By that time, you're almost convinced, and you've been doing a lot of thinking about what you can do. The story I'm telling has been sinking in, but you aren't completely willing to accept it. You notice that the models are all mounted on tables, and that they're a lot smaller than you thought. They seem to be in chronological order, and the latest one, marked 2147, Rinks Dynapatty, is about the size of a desk telephone. The earlier ones are larger, of course, clumsier, but with variations, probably depending on the power output. A big sign on the ceiling gives a lot of dope on atomic generators, explaining that this is the first invention which leaped full-blown into basically final form. You study it, but it mentions casually the inventor, without giving his name. Either they don't know it, or they take it for granted that everyone does, which seems more probable. They call attention to the fact that they have the original model of the first atomic generator built, complete with design drawings, original manuscript on operation, and full patent application. They state that it has all major refinements, operating on any fuel, producing electricity at any desired voltage up to 5 million, any chosen cyclic rate from direct current to 1000 megacycles, and any amperage up to 1000, its maximum power output being 50 kilowatts, limited by the current carrying capacity of the outputs. They also mention that the operating principle is still being investigated, and that only such refinements as better alloys and the addition of magnetic and nucleatric current outlets have been added since the original. So you go to the end and look over the thing. It's simply a square box with a huge plug on each side, and a set of vernier controls on top, plus a little hole marked in old-style spelling, "Drop BBs or wire here." Apparently that's the way it's fueled. It's about 1 foot on each side. "Nice," the guard says over your shoulder. "It finally wore out one of the cathode grids and we had to replace that. But otherwise it's exactly as the great inventor made it, and it still operates as well as ever. Like to have me tell you about it?" "Not particularly," you begin, and then realize bad manners might be conspicuous here. While you're searching for an answer, the guard pulls something out of his pocket and stares at it. Fine. The mayor of Alta Cicaba, Centaurian, you know, is arriving. But I'll be back in about 10 minutes. He wants to examine some of the weapons for a monograph on Centaurian primitives compared to 19th century man. You'll pardon me?" You pardon him pretty eagerly, and he wanders off happily. You go up to the head of the line, to that Rinks Diner Patter, or whatever it transliterates to. That's small and you can carry it, but the darn thing is absolutely fixed. You can't see any bolts, but you can't budge it either. You work down the line. It'd be foolish to take the early model, if you can get one with built-in magnetic current terminals, Ehrenhaft or some other principle, and nuclear binding force energy terminals, but they're all held down by the same Watcher-McCollum effect. And finally, you're right back beside the original first model. It's probably bolted down too, but you try it tentatively, and you find it moves. There's a little sign under it, indicating you shouldn't touch it, since the gravistatic plate is being renewed. Well, you won't be able to change the time cycle by doing anything I haven't told you, but a working model such as that is a handy thing. You lift it. It only weighs about 50 pounds. Naturally, it can be carried. You expect a warning bell, but nothing happens. As a matter of fact, if you'd stop drinking so much of that scotch and staring at the time machine out there now, you'd hear what I'm saying and know what will happen to you. But of course, just as I did, you're going to miss a lot of what I say from now on, and have to find out for yourself. But maybe some of it helps. I've tried to remember how much I remembered after he told me, but I can't be sure. So I'll keep on talking. I probably can't help it anyhow. Preset, you might say. Well, you stagger down the corridor, looking out for the guard, but all seems clear. Then you hear his voice from the weapons room. You bend down and try to scurry past, but you know you're in full view. Nothing happens, though. You stumble down the stairs, feeling all the futuristic rays in the world on your back, and still nothing happens. Ahead of you, the gate is closed. You reach it, and it opens obligingly by itself. You breathe a quick sigh of relief and start out onto the street. Then there's a yell behind you. You don't wait. You put one leg in front of the other, and you begin racing down the walk, ducking past people who stare at you with expressions you haven't time to see. There's another yell behind you. Something goes over your head and drops on the sidewalk just in front of your feet with a sudden ringing sound. You don't wait to find out about that either. Somebody reaches out a hand to catch you and you dart past. The street is pretty clear now, and you jolt along with your arms seeming to come out of the sockets, and that atomic generator getting heavier at every step. Out of nowhere, something in a blue uniform about 6 feet tall and on the beefy side appears, and the badge hasn't changed much. The cop catches your arm and you know you're not going to get away, so you stop. "You can't exert yourself that hard in this heat, fellow," the cop says. "There are laws against that without a yellow sticker. Here, let me grab you a taxi." Reaction sets in a bit and your knees begin to buckle, but you shake your head and come up for air. I left my money home," you begin. The cop nods. "Oh, that explains it. Fine, I won't have to give you an appearance schedule, but you should have come to me." He reaches out and taps a pedestrian lightly on the shoulder. "Sir, an emergency request. Would you help this gentleman?" The pedestrian grins, looks at his watch and nods. "How far?" You did notice the name of the building from which you came, and you mutter it. The stranger nods again, reaches out and picks up the other side of the generator, blowing a little whistle the cop hands him. Pedestrians begin to move aside, and you and the stranger jog down the street at a trot, with a nice clear path, while the cop stands beaming at you both. That way it isn't so bad, and you begin to see why I decided I might like to stay in the future. But all the same, the organised cooperation here doesn't look too good. The guard can get the same and be there before you. And he is. He stands just inside the door of the building as you reach it. The stranger lifts an eyebrow and goes off at once when you nod at him, not waiting for thanks. And the guard comes up holding some dinkus in his hand about the size of a big folding camera, and not too dissimilar in other ways. He snaps it open and you get set to duck. "You forgot the prints, monograph and patent applications," he says. "They go with the generator. We don't like to have them separated. A good thing I knew the production office of Atoms and Axioms was in this building. Just let us know when you're finished with the model and we'll pick it up." You swallow several sets of tonsils you had removed years before, and take the bundle of papers he hands you out of the little case. He pumps you for some more information, which you give him at random. It seems to satisfy your amiable guard friend. He finally smiles in satisfaction and heads back to the museum. You still don't believe it, but you pick up the atomic generator and the information sheets, and you head down toward the service elevator. There is no button on it. In fact, there's no door there. You start looking for other doors or corridors, but you know this is right. The signs along the halls are the same as they were. Then there's a sort of cough and something dilates in the wall. It forms a perfect door and the elevator stands there waiting. You get in, gulping out something about going all the way down, and then wonder how a machine geared for voice operation can make anything of that. What the deuce would that lowest basement be called? But the elevator is closed and is moving downward in a hurry. It coughs again, and you're at the original level. You get out, and realize you don't have a light. You'll never know what you stumbled over, but somehow you move back in the direction of the time machine, bumping against boxes, staggering here and there, and trying to find the right place by sheer feel. Then a shred of dim light appears. It's the weak light in the time machine. You've located it. You put the atomic generator in the luggage space, throw the papers down beside it, and climb into the cockpit, sweating and mumbling. You reach forward toward the green button and hesitate. There's a red one beside it, and you finally decide on that. Suddenly, there's a confused yell from the direction of the elevator, and a beam of light strikes against your eyes with a shout punctuating it. Your finger touches the red button. You'll never know what the shouting was about, whether they finally doped out the fact that they'd been robbed, or whether they were trying to help you. You don't care which it is. The field springs up around you, and the next button you touch, the one on the board that hasn't been used so far, sends you off into nothingness. There is no beam of light, you can't hear a thing, and you're safe. It isn't much of a trip back. You sit there smoking and letting your nerves settle back to normal. You notice a third set of buttons with some pencil marks over them. Press these to return to yourself 30 years, and you begin waiting for the air to get stale. It doesn't, because there is only one of you this time. Instead, everything flashes off and you're sitting in the time machine in your own backyard. You'll figure out the cycle in more details later. You get into the machine in front of your house, go to the future in the sub-basement, land in your backyard, and then hop back 30 years to pick up yourself, landing in front of your house. Just that. But right then, you don't care. You jump out and start pulling out that atomic generator and taking it inside. It isn't hard to disassemble, but you don't learn a thing. Just some plates of metal, some spiral coils, and a few odds and ends. All things that can be made easily enough, all obviously of common metals. But when you put it together again, about an hour later, you notice something. Everything in it is brand new, and there's one set of copper wires missing. It won't work. You put some number 12 house wire in, exactly like the set on the other side, drop in some iron filings and try it again. And with the control set at 120 volts, 60 cycles and 15 amperes, you get just that. You don't need the power company anymore. And you feel a little happier when you realize that the luggage space wasn't insulated from time effects by a field, so the motor is moved backward in time somehow, and is back to its original youth, minus the replaced wires the guard mentioned, which probably wore out because of the makeshift job you've just done. But you begin getting more of a jolt when you find that the papers are all in your own writing, that your name is down as the inventor, and that the date of the patent application is 1951. It will begin to soak in then. You pick up an atomic generator in the future and bring it back to the past, your present, so that it can be put in the museum with you as the inventor so you can steal it to be the inventor. And you do it in a time machine which you bring back to yourself to take yourself into the future to return to take back to yourself. Who invented what? And who built which? Before long, your riches from the generator are piling in. Little kids from school are coming around to stare at the man who changed history and made atomic power so common that no nation could hope to be anything but a democracy, and a peaceful one, after some of the worst times in history for a few years. Your name eventually becomes as common as Ampere or Faraday, or any other spelled without a capital letter. But you're thinking of the puzzle. You can't find any answer. One day you come across an old poem, something about some folks calling it evolution and others calling it God. You go out, make a few provisions for the future, and come back to climb into the time machine that's waiting in the building you had put around it. Then you'll be knocking on your own door 30 years back, or right now from your view, and telling your younger self all these things I'm telling you. But now, well, the drinks are finished. You're woozy enough to go along with me without protest, and I want to find out just why those people up there came looking for you and shouting before the time machine left. Let's go.
Remember to hit the like button to support the channel. Thanks.
The Course of Logic by Lester Del Rey. Narrated by William Skye. They made one little mistake, very natural, and disastrous. The male Sylph plodded forward wearily at 60 miles an hour, pausing only long enough to uproot and wolf down one of the rare scrub trees directly in its path. Its 300 tons of massive body shook the ground as the great hind legs thumped along, and every cell of it ached with hunger. It was warm-blooded, despite its vaguely reptilian appearance. Only meat could satisfy its need for energy, but the great herds lay 1,000 miles to the north of this barren land. Inside the Sylph, the 2-pound network of converted nerve cells that was Arnek brooded darkly in self-pity and resentment against the inflexible female logic of his mate. Petara had won her point, as she always did. Now she might at least have shown some consideration for him and his Sylph. "Arnek!" The call came sharply on one of the guard frequencies of the mental spectrum. "Arnek, stop lagging and get up here!" He could feel his nerve body tense from horn tip to tail root, but he stifled his response and quickened his pace. Ahead, the trail left by Petara's legs led through a gully and up a rise to the lip of a small stony basin. The 400 tons of Petara's female Sylph squatted below the edge, and the great head was half hidden as it peered downward around a boulder. "Quiet!" Petara ordered sharply. Then, as Arnek switched from a thudding run to a smooth, creeping approach, the mental impulse took on a note of triumph. "Look down there and then tell me I don't know a ship trail from a meteor." The bowl was bright in the glare of the orange sunlight, but at first Arnek saw nothing. Then, as his gaze swept back toward the nearer section, he blinked his great eyes, only half believing what they registered. It was a small thing, hardly taller than Arnek's Sylph, maybe not even as tall, but it was too regular and obviously artificial, a pointed cylinder, to be a meteorite. Between two of the base fins there seemed to be an opening, with a miniature ramp leading down to the ground. It looked like a delicately precise model of a spaceship from the dawn of time. It was obviously too small to be more than a message carrier, yet as he looked more closely he could see motion. 2 tiny creatures, not more than 6 feet in height, were scurrying around near the base. Bright patches of fur or decoration covered them, and they seemed to move on 2 of their 4 limbs. Arnek shivered down the length of his nerves with an ancient distaste for crawling things. "Let's go back," he suggested uneasily. "There's nothing here for us, and I'm hungry." "Don't be silly," Petara answered, and the old female superiority was strong in the thought. "Of course it's too small for us. I knew that when I saw the landing trail yesterday evening. It must be an instrument probe, with test animals. If it has telemetering equipment, though..." Arnek tested the 3 spectra uneasily. At this distance, even a tight beam should be detectable, but he could feel nothing. There was only the steady wash of inertia-gravitic wavules, the electromagnetic noise from the sun, and the growing, contemptuous mental leakage from Petara. Then he squirmed in embarrassment as his eyes detected the cracked base of the little ship. Obviously, it had landed hard, probably hard enough to ruin instruments and release the 2 creatures. He should have noticed that at once. There was no time to admit his error, however. Petara's Sylph lunged upright and the great rear legs began pulping ground and rocks in a full charge. Arnek leaped to follow out of old hunting habit. On a downgrade, his lighter Sylph soon caught up with the other. Below, the 2 humans swung around at the earth-shaking thunder of the charge and started a frantic scrambling. They were making shrill sounds now, and the extreme low band of the mental spectrum held faint impulses. Petara's thoughts lashed against his nerves. "Cut them off! Don't let them back to the probe! They must have destruct conditioning!" In the hunt, Arnek had long since become only an extension of his dominant mate. Now he folded his forelegs and dropped his head and neck into a javelin aimed between humans and ships. The smaller of the 2 was almost at the ramp. At the last moment, moved by a sudden impulse, Arnek dropped his head lower and retracted his neck to soften the blow. He felt the human midge strike against his snout and go caroming off, to land 50 feet away. Dim pain impulses stirred in the low mental background. Anger, or something like it, came from the other creature. Arnek braked and pivoted sharply. The larger human had run forward toward the bloodied smaller figure, but as the Sylph's head faced the creature, one of the human's arms darted to something strapped about its middle. There was a surprising blast of sound. A stream of tiny exploding pellets struck against Arnek's snout. He bellowed in annoyance and took a step forward, lifting a foreleg to swat at the midge. It jerked back, then it darted forward, bending to lift its companion in its forelimbs. Either the gravity here was less than on its own homeworld, or the thing was stronger than it looked. The first leap sent the burdened human backwards more than 20 feet, then it was bounding off in frantic efforts to reach the further side of the depression where a jumble of rocks might give it cover. There was amusement in Patara's thoughts. If your hunger is so great, why didn't you eat them? They aren't much, of course, but the blood smells sweet enough. Arnek sighed along his nerves, unable to answer. Let Patara put it down to another male whim if she liked, but he hadn't thought of eating them before. There had been something cute and pathetic about them. They reminded him of the little gullah he had owned in his youth in a long-lost, ruined universe. It had a weapon, he commented, changing the subject. Patara rumbled an assent. I noticed. Interesting conditioning. The probe builders must have superb nerve development to do that to the lower orders. They'll make good sylphs. Now, let's see what we can find in the probe. She slipped a claw into the base opening and began working it upwards as delicately as the clumsy foreleg would permit. Arnek moved forward to help, but she waved him back impatiently, and he waited meekly until she finished. She was right, of course. As a male, he had no training with mechanisms. He would only have ruined whatever lay inside. It was a marvellously delicate set of machinery, though the theory behind the engineering seemed rather elementary. Arnek studied what he could of it, growing more puzzled. Maybe the creatures operated it, he suggested. What makes you think so? I don't know. It just seems somehow... Intuition! Patara snorted. Then she seemed less certain. Yet I can't blame you this time. It does almost look that way, but it's logically impossible. Besides, there are automatic controls for guiding the probe. The builders probably just amused themselves the way we once put slurry pods in the gullah pens. Ah, this looks sound enough. She pulled a tiny box out of the wreckage that had been spread out flat on the ground. With infinite care, she managed to hook one claw over a miniature control. Almost immediately, radio waves began forming a recurrent pattern along their nerves, coming in long and short pulses. Half an hour later, there was another faint quiver of radio waves from space, this time completely modulated. Even Arnek could realize that it was on the same frequency, but dopplered to indicate something approaching their world. He stopped browsing for the few stunted trees and came back to join his mate. Night was just falling. Patara led them back toward the rock ledge from which they had first spied the probe. There was a large fissure in the rocks into which they could just squeeze, and which would hide them from the sight of any landing craft. A moon came up, and they could see the depression clearly in its light. Now Arnek saw the larger human slipping across the ground toward the wreck of the probe. It darted about frantically, but with an appearance of purpose. A few moments later it was retreating, carrying a load of packages with it. It seems almost intelligent, he said softly. He strained to follow the faint wash of impressions on the lower band. There was something there that struck a familiar chord in his thoughts, but he could not decode it. Just instinct, Patara dismissed it with cool logic. A female seeking food for the injured mate. Arnek sighed uncomfortably. It doesn't seem female, he objected. Another hunch? Don't be silly, Arnek. It has to be a female. The larger, stronger, and more intelligent form is always female. How else could it care for the young? It needs ability for a whole family, while the male needs only enough for himself. The laws of evolution are logical, or we wouldn't have evolved at all. There was no answer to such logic other than the vague discontent Arnek felt, and he knew that was only because of his envy of the greater ability of the other sex. He settled back, ruminating hungrily and listening to the signal from space. The little box from the wreck was silent now, but the other signals were stronger. Patara nodded. They're coming. After 400 years we have a chance. New sylphs to breed. A chance to reproduce ourselves and multiply. A new universe for our own. There was immense satisfaction with self in her thoughts. Well, I earned it. Arnek could not deny it. It had been more than 400 years in this galaxy. 8,000 of them had set out, leaving behind a small ancient universe being wrecked by the horror of an exploding supernova. They had been driven out from the planetary conquests of 1 billion years and had sought refuge across intergalactic space to this universe. 100 of the marvellously adapted sylphs of their universe had survived the eons of suspended animation to preserve their occupants. And then had come the hunt for new sylph forms, since the trip had aged the others beyond the power of reproduction, in spite of all their precautions. Finding a sylph form was never easy. There had been only 3 animals that had served in their entire old galaxy. Only a creature with several pounds of nerve tissues could hold the nuclear proteins of the sentient Anas. And that required huge creatures, since nerve tissue was always so thinly scattered in normal flesh. They had toured a quadrant of the new galaxy, studying planet after planet before they found this world. Here the great beasts were barely sufficiently endowed with nerve fibre. 8 Anas had survived this far. 6 failed to stand the shock of entry and regrowth in the new self forms. Now there was only the one pair, Arnek and Patara. Left to himself, Arnek would have perished long ago. Their hope of retraining the clumsy forelegs of the self forms had proved futile, and the nerve capacity was too low for them to exercise their full faculties. The converted nuclei of the cells was never quite efficient either, and there seemed no hope of ever reproducing their own. Certainly no newly budded Ana could survive the metamorphosis into these awkward bodies. That had been almost impossible for mature powers. Nor could a young Ana survive long without a sylph. 400 years, and now, he thought, he was tired. It no longer mattered. His home lay in ruins eons away. Let Patara worry about it. He twisted his neck back to put his snout under his tail and tried to sleep, while hunger rumbled noisily in his stomach. The sun was glaring down again when he awoke to the nudging of Patara's snout, and there was a roaring in the air above. Something rushed downwards, bellowing out thrust against gravity. It was another ship, landing over the wreckage of the first. But it was no monster such as might have carried new and better sylph forms. It was hardly larger than the first, though it somehow seemed to be better made. It landed smoothly and squatted on the ground, sending out signals. "Another probe," Patara said. There was disappointment in her thoughts, quickly masked by cold logic. "Naturally they'd wait to check with something like this. There will probably be several probes before they decide they have to investigate personally. All right, we'll give them something to worry about." She was lunging to her feet just as an opening appeared in the ship. This time something ran out, down the ramp, a tiny gadget of churning tracks and metal carapace, chuffing out shrill little motor sounds. It circled briefly and then headed across the bowl. "Stop it," Patara ordered. "It may have a camera, so don't waste time. The less the builders learn about us, the better." His hunger had so far failed to weaken him, and he was covering the ground at 200 miles an hour before the little vehicle had picked up a tenth of that speed. At the last moment, it seemed to be aware of him. There was a wash of mental shock and confusion. Then his snout hit the car in a sideswipe that tossed it 50 feet to land on its back. He lumbered forward to squash it, then hesitated. An opening had appeared, and 2 of the tiny humans were staggering out. One was supporting the other. At sight of him, both stopped in shock. For a second, they stood rooted to the ground. Then the larger one began a clumsy effort at running, half carrying the other. Blood left a trail behind them. Arnek could have squashed them with a single thrust of his leg, but he stood, irresolutely, observing the garments and headgear they wore, remembering his youth and a gullah draped with a ribbon and bells. They were heading for the rocks nearest them, a long way from where the first 2 had found refuge. For a second, he felt impelled to turn them and drive them toward the others. Then a wave of amusement from Patara checked him. "They'd never reach that far," she called. "They can't survive the crash of their vehicle. Let them go." Arnek felt the faint, murky mental signals so low on the band, and he knew Patara was right. They were staggering now, and the smaller one seemed to be only partly conscious. He sighed and scooped up the ground car, carrying it back to Patara. This time his mate was making no effort to rip the ship apart. She was staring through one of the tiny ports, trying to fit her great eye against it, and she seemed uncertain. Finally, she took the ground car and began dismantling it, looking for automatic or remote controls. There were none. "Maybe the creatures operated it, and the ship," Arnek said. He expected the same reaction the remark had drawn before. This time Patara showed no amusement. Her great head shook in puzzlement. "About 1 time in 10,000 a crazy male hunch comes true," she muttered. "Intuition. It's against all logic. But there are only manual controls here. Where are those silly creatures?" The 2 that had arrived last were pitifully exposed, just within an opening in the rocks. It was a shallow space, hopeless to defend. The smaller one lay supine, but the larger human faced the 2 sylphs, holding his pitiful weapon, and waited grimly until they were almost within reach. This time the explosive pellets were aimed for their eyes. Patara dropped her eyelids, swearing as the missiles stung. She reached in with a short foreleg. There was a single shrill cry and the sound of the weapon striking against a rock. The low band was suddenly quiet. Arnek heard a soft gulp. When he looked, the larger human was gone. A sudden shock ran through Patara's thoughts. Her great eyes blinked and a huge tongue ran over her lips. "Nerve fibre!" Her shout covered the entire spectrum. "Arnek, there are pounds of nerve fibre in the creature. High grade, better than that in these Sylph forms. As good as that in any Sylph. Here, give me the other. She didn't wait for Arnek's help, however. She dragged the corpse out and began working as delicately as the Sylph body would permit. Her mental signals were a blur. Then she stopped, staring down at what she held. There, a cavity in the head, filled with nerve fibres. There must be 3 pounds there alone. What freak of evolution would put them all together in such a vulnerable spot? And yet, there's a certain efficiency about it. It isn't logical, and yet it is. Abruptly, the evidence was gone. Come on, she ordered. Arnek sighed and his stomach rumbled a protest, but he ignored it. What good is it? We surely can't make a Sylph out of a tiny thing like that. Why not? Contempt for male thought was mixed with smug satisfaction for her own. We don't use the other cells anyhow. Oh, there will be difficulties. They may be short-lived. But with such high-grade fibre, we can risk infiltrating a new one as often as we need. There should be enough of them. They probably have half a dozen to a litter twice a year, like most small forms. Possibly billions of them can live on a single planet. And since they're colonizing other worlds like this one... Even Arnek could see the logic behind Patara's assumption in that. Colonizing would explain the sending out of a male and female in each ship, with ships spread out days apart. It wasn't the most efficient method, but it usually ensured against any major accident. His people had used the same method at times. It all seemed quite logical, but Arnek felt a tension of intuition along his entire nerve network. No Anna had ever used a Sylph capable of independent intelligence. There must be something wrong with it. Once they infiltrated the new Sylph, of course, they could soon convert enough nerves to blank out all control from their carriers. But, "They're weapons!" he cried. "Patara, in those bodies! We'd be vulnerable to their weapons! And during the 10 days we have to hibernate to grow into their nerves, they'd kill us!" Patara grunted. "Sometimes," she admitted, "you almost think like a female. They would kill us, of course, if we stupidly stayed where later arrivals could find us. Now, come on, we've got to chase the creatures around today until they're tired enough to sleep soundly. And don't let them get near that ship either." It was a bitter day for Arnek. His stomach protested, and by the end of the chase his legs were beginning to weaken. But ahead of them, the 2 humans were staggering in the light of the setting sun. The smaller was leaning on the larger as they finally found and entered the little cave near the ship that Patara had chosen for them long before. Night had fallen before Patara was satisfied. The 2 Sylphs moved forward as softly as they could, but the loud breathing noises went on, and there was no stir of alarm anywhere on the mental band. "Do you remember everything?" Patara asked. "You've got to regain consciousness after the first stage. You can do that if you set your mind to it." "I remember," Arnek agreed wearily. He'd had the whole routine drilled into him repeatedly until he was sick of it. It was like the horror of having her force him to adapt to this present Sylph. While he had been ready to accept assimilation, she had fought with him and with her own transformation, refusing to admit even his intuition that their race was ended. Only her cold logic had saved them. He could not deny it now. "Be sure you take the smaller male body," she warned again. "Unless that's the female. You found evolution different in these creatures once," he reminded her. For a moment, she was silent. Then there was a mental shrug and almost amusement as she answered. "Matching sex isn't logically necessary. It might even be an interesting amusement. But I must have the larger body." She began shifting at once. The Sylph gasped and tried to thresh about in death as Patara released control. Arnek sighed to himself and began to follow. It was worse than he remembered. After the centuries, the cells hated to give up their fixed form. The agony of the Sylph fed back to him until his withdrawal stopped its heart. But slowly the nuclear matter flowed from the cells and up the pathways to their egress, taking the minimum of nutrient fluid with them. It took nearly an hour, and he could see the thin film of Patara already lying over the sleeping human. He began hurrying now, remembering her warning that the humans would not stay here once they wakened to find the 2 abandoned Sylphs dead. He forced himself over the hateful dryness of the floor, up to the open mouth. Beyond lay the lungs, the circulatory system, and then the strange nerve bundle in the skull. Some of it was ugly, and some was hard, but the last stage was almost pleasant. He had forgotten how unsatisfactory the nerves of the last Sylph had been. These were like coming home to a friendly world in a universe that had died too long ago and far away. For a time he was almost glad that he had not died with it. Then the first allergic reactions began, and he had to relapse into instinct, to let his being fight to save both himself and his host cells from the reaction. He set the first stage up, however. This time he managed with no help from Patara, Then he relapsed into unconsciousness, making no effort to control his new Sylph yet. He'd have to revise when the Sylph awoke, he told himself. But it was only a dream order, half completed. It was a sudden, painful pressure of acceleration that finally brought him out of his torpor. He felt half sick, and he could vaguely sense that the new Sylph was fevered and uncomfortable. But amazingly, it was sitting up, and around it was a room bigger than the whole ship had seemed, and controls under its hand and fantastic equipment. "It's about time," Pitara's thoughts reached him. They were weak now, since it was hard to transmit in a partial stage, but they were cold and sure. "I've been aware for hours, while the Sylphs reached the ship and took off. We've been off planet for at least an hour, long enough to study their body controls and to learn how the ship operates." Arnek sighed to himself while the pressure of tension refused to leave. "Are you sure?" "Of course I'm sure. These are primitive machines, and I learned most of it from dismantling the first. They're primitive, but they're logical enough for understanding. I can even control the Sylph when she isn't aware." The larger human suddenly moved the controls, then jerked its hand back, staring at it. Words came to the ears of the Sylph in which Arnek rode. "I'm sick, Luke. I've got the twitches." The words brought stirring strongly on the low band, almost but not quite understandably. They also brought a vocal reply from the other human. "Be glad you can twitch. Some bug we picked up, but it's better than being eaten. We're in the Clover, kid. Maybe we've still got more cop ships tailing us, but let 'em look. When they find the dinosaurs and what's left of our ship, they'll stop looking. The heat's going to be off. We can get back to Earth in a year or so and really live." Batara's thoughts cut through Arnek's efforts to understand. "Reproduction feelings," she reported in satisfaction. "They must have higher fertility than I hoped if they can think of it while sick." Then her thoughts sharpened. "Take over your Sylph." The human at the board slumped abruptly. Arnek lashed out from the converted cells, felt a brief protest, and then was alone in the brain of the Sylph. He could not yet control it, but it had no independent will. "There is food and water near if we have to rouse from hibernation while we grow into these Sylphs," Pitara reported. "Now, help me if you can." Arnek let his weak thoughts blend into hers, trying to give strength as she had often done to him. She was straining her utmost will. Slowly and in jerks, the arm moved across the control board and clumsy fingers managed to move controls. And at last, from Pitara's mind, Arnek began to see the plan. There was fuel enough to bring them at maximum speed across an eddy of the galaxy toward the lone sun they had found long before. There a single planet swung in orbit, a planet with food but no dangerous animal life. And there they could wait and grow strong, and multiply as their Sylphs multiplied. They could reach it almost as soon as they came out of hibernation finally, and it would be a safe haven in its isolation. There would be no fuel for further travel, but that could wait while their numbers grew and they could restore their lost technology and weapons with the clever hands of the human Sylphs. Then they could take over the galaxy as they had taken the one so long away. The hands fumbled under the limited control, but they moved across the board, and the automatic pilot was finally set and sealed. Logic, Arnek thought softly, and there was a wonder at a mind like Pitara's that could achieve such understanding of even alien mechanisms. Yet under it, there was still a cold knot of fear along his nerves. Pitara's thoughts had begun to fade from the strain and the long interruption to her hibernation, but now she caught momentary control again. There was appreciation in them for his praise, and then there was amusement. "Logic," she agreed, "but perhaps intuition isn't too bad for a male. You've been right twice." "Twice?" Arnek asked. He'd been somehow right that the Sylphs controlled their own ships, of course, but... "Twice," Pitara said. "I've just realized my Sylph is a male, as you suggested it might be. Amusing reversing the sexes, isn't it?" She tried to say something else, but the strain was too much, and full hibernation swept her mind away from that of Arnek. Arnek sat frozen for a time in his Sylph, knowing that it was also male. Then he turned it somehow to face the lost galaxy where his race had known its day, and now entered its eternal night.
Thanks for listening. Remember, you can listen to my narration of Lords of Conquest Iron Raven by Nick Mayhew through the links in the description. And while you're there, go sign up to my Substack. There you get 3 free stories a week, ad-free in video, audio and podcast form, all sent in a helpful email every Saturday. And signing up to a paid tier gets you longer videos, novelettes and serialized novels. If you enjoy what I do, that's the best way to support me. Thanks, and see you there.